Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel where we discuss, we analyze, we comment, and we talk about all aspects of the game of chess. This is the last video we're creating for the year 2025, and the best wishes for a happy and joyful and prosperous year 2026 filled with success. And for this last video, we have a special program. In the past, you may remember we had special programs about my Facebook friends that had suggested various games they had played. And now it's time for a friend of mine outside Facebook, as they say, a friend in real life, whose game we're going to present. It is Linda Bellamy. Linda Bellamy, her maiden name was Linda Bott. And when she was a small child, she grew up in England. She was winning one youth tournament after another, and she became a chess prodigy and was very famous at some point. But later, due to life commitments, she had to give up chess for about 55 years. She became a doctor in psychology, and she recently authored a book called The Safety Variation, Chess Thinking for Accident Prevention. This is a book I'm currently reading and I'm highly recommending. And she starts asking the question, what can chess teach us about safety? And what she's doing is she's using a metaphor as if preventing accidents is like a chess game. On the one side, it's team safety, and on the other side, it's hazard. And we need to use the same mentality in real life that we're using in chess in order to prevent accidents. Usually, before the accident happens, nobody can ever think that this could have happened. It's beyond our imagination, but after it happens, we think, how could we not see it in advance? Same thing like in chess. But enough about the author, Linda Bellamy, and now it's time for the chess player, Linda Bellamy. And this game that she suggested is a game that she played a couple of months ago in October at the Hoogeven Amateur Tournament in Netherlands. Currently, Linda Bellamy is living in Netherlands and she's playing for the team of Netherlands. And she faced another Dutch player, Ralf van der Berg. When they played, his rating was 1816 and Linda's was 1642, meaning he was ahead by 174 points. And he was the favorite, of course. And we're going now to share the screen of chess.com. And we need a moment until we set everything okay. And now we can share the screen. And here we are. This is the screen of chess.com. And we use the same method we've used for most of the games. We're going to enter the moves by hand as we copy them from the score sheet one by one. On the left side, you're going to see the position. And on the right side, you're going to see the computer evaluation. If the computer thinks that white is doing better, you'll see a positive number, or black is doing better, a negative number. And the computer will make a comment on the move and will tell us what was the best move for the player that just played and what are the top 5 options for the player whose turn is to come. Ralf, the opponent of Linda, had the white pieces and he starts with pawn going to d4. These together with the pawn to e4, the most popular moves for white. And for black, the most popular responses is either knight goes to f6 or pawn to d5. Linda goes with the symmetric variation pawn to d5. And usually when you start with the d pawn, the next choice is the c pawn. So Ralf sends his pawn to c4 and Linda the pawn to e6. These are standard moves. So book, you see all these little books here, book moves. Knight to c3 for Ralf, knight to f6 for Linda. And now Ralf starts taking the pawns. He takes on d5. And now Linda has 2 choices. In fact, we can take it back 3 ways, but forget about the queen because then the knight will take the queen. I can take it either the pawn on e6 or the knight on f6. It's better to take with a pawn, because if you take the knight like I used to do before I learned better, then white sends the pawn to e4 and gains more space, and black needs to waste the tempo thinking where to place the knight. So Linda takes with the e-pawn, and Ralf places his bishop on g5 and pins the knight at f6, because behind it is a queen. This is the last of the book moves, and Linda replies with the bishop to e6. We completed the first 5 moves, and you're going to see that white, Ralf, is ahead by 0.41. This means, of course, very little. It mostly means that white starts first. And let's continue. Ralf sends pawn to e3, pawn to c6 for Linda, bishop to d3 for Ralf, pawn to h6 for Linda. That poses a dilemma to the white bishop. Take the knight, go back, or what? If I go back, there's only 2 choices, f4 and h4. And Ralf decides to go back to h4 and keep the pin, but Linda breaks the pin by placing the bishop on e7. Knight to f3 for Ralf, kingside castling for Linda, kingside castling also for Ralf, and rook to e8 for Linda. At this time, we completed the first 10 moves, and white, Ralf, is ahead by 0.75. Let's see how game continues. These small differences of less than 1 mean almost nothing. Pawn to h3 for Ralf that doesn't like Linda's bishop to go, or even the knight to go to g4 and pin the knight on f3 if the bishop goes. And Linda develops the knight, goes to d7. Bishop to g3 for Ralf, that this bishop now controls many crucial squares from h2 until b8. Rook to c8 for Linda, that places the rook in position near the center. Rook to b1 for Ralf, that seems ready to start expanding along the queen side. Pawn to a5 for Linda, that wants to stop the a and b pawns of Ralf being pushed and creating havoc. Pawn to a3 for Ralf, that pushes anyway, and pawn to b5 for Linda. Pawn to b4 for Ralf, that continues the expansion along the queen side. Inaccuracy says the computer. From now on, Linda is ahead, and Linda will take the pawn at b4. We completed the first 15 moves, and now Linda is ahead by 0.08, almost nothing, but at least it seems that she's being ahead now. Let's continue. Pawn to b4 for Ralf, knight to b6 for Linda, knight to e5 for Ralf, and Linda places the bishop on c4. Now, this bishop is an outpost in the sense that there is no pawn on the b or the d file from white that can attack the knight, because they already made it to the 4th rank. However, if Ralf chooses, he can take the knight with his bishop on d3, but in this case, he will have given Linda a protected passed pawn. Whichever pawn takes back on c4, it is passed in the sense that there are no pawns on b or d that can take it. So Ralf would need to think twice before replacing the outpost knight on c4 with a protected passed pawn, and also lose a bishop for a knight. That usually is not a good idea. But let's see how game continues. Pawn to e4 for Ralf, he doesn't take the knight. Linda takes on e4. Ralf takes also pawn on e4. And Linda takes on e5. Ralf will check on f6 with a knight, and exchange of bishops, exchange of knights on f6. Linda takes back with a bishop. We completed the first 20 moves. The score is 0.10. Linda with the black pieces is ahead. But this means almost nothing. And Ralf, of course, will take the knight on e5, attack the bishop on f6, and the bishop has to go back to e7. Ralf will place his queen on c2, threatens the check. On h7, this check gives almost nothing, but Linda doesn't even want to think about it, places king on h8. And you'll see why, even though the check seems to be harmless, because Ralf places his rook on d1. If the king was on g8, the danger would be that suddenly Ralf can check with the bishop on h7, and while king deals the check, most likely takes a bishop, then the white rook on d1 can take the black queen on d8. But by moving the king on h8, Linda doesn't have to worry about it. Still, it's not an unsolvable problem, but even the easy problems, you don't need any more problems. Let's see. Linda continues with queen going to b6. So she'll not even need to worry about this theoretical possibility any longer. And Ralph will send his bishop to f5. And Linda places her pawn on c5. At this moment, we'll start reading from the notes that Linda has made of this game. See how she was going through that game. Linda says, play where you are strong, meaning on the queen side. And let's see how game continues now. Bishop takes on e6. Ralph changes on e6. And Linda takes on e6. At this point, we completed the first 25 moves, and Linda is ahead by 0.51. Bishop takes. Now, the problem that Ralph may face is if he does nothing, pawn takes on b4 for Linda will use the c5 pawn to take on b4, and then Ralph cannot recapture the rook because then he loses his queen. And in order to avoid this possibility, he takes first on c5, and Linda takes on c5. And at this point, what you are going to see is that Linda already created a pass pawn on b5 and also wins the tempo by threatening the queen on c2. But long term, most important, the pawn at b5 could be very dangerous. It can start being pushed, and the nearer it comes to b1 to get promoted, the more dangerous and more valuable it's going to be. Ralph, first of all, needs to save his queen, send it to e2 before anything else, and by doing so, also protects the pawn on e5. And Linda places the rook on b8. Why? Because the best way to protect a pass pawn and also to attack a pass pawn is from the back. Because as the pawn moves, the rook on b8 will have more and more space. Before the rook on c5, yes, it protected the pawn on b5, and the pawn on b5 could not move. If it go to b4, it would be lost, but not any longer. It can move quite far because the rook on b8 protects it. Queen to d3 is for Linda. Rook to d8 for queen to d3, I'm sorry, it's for Ralph. Rook to d8 is for Linda, that threatens the queen on d3. Queen goes to b3. And now have exchanges. Rook goes to d1 check for Linda, and queen takes back on d1. Why exchanges? Because with the pass pawn that Linda has, although material is the same, it is each side has 4 pawns, but with these pass pawns, Linda would love to have queens, rooks, and bishop disappearing, and also this pawn is not just a pass pawn, but outside pass pawn, meaning without queens, rooks, and bishops, this pawn could make it to promotion, and even if the white king was what they say within the square, I could stop it, then the black king would take the pawns, the white pawns on king side, and black would win using the king side pawns. But let's see how game continues. Rook to d5 for Linda, and threatens the white queen once again. We completed the first 30 moves, and Linda is ahead with black pieces by 0.69. Let's continue the game. Queen to b3 is for Ralph. Pawn to b4 for Linda, that pushes it one more square near promotion, and now it has wonderful support by the bishop on e7. What does this mean? It means that it doesn't matter if both queen and rook attack the pawn, they cannot take it, even if the bishop is only one supporting, because at the very minimum, white is going to lose the exchange at most for a pawn. King to h2 for Ralf, that doesn't want to have to deal with checks on the first rank. And pawn to g5. Linda wants also to attack on the other side, not only the b4 pawn, but also the king side. Queen to a4 for Ralph, perhaps hoping to put the queen on e8 and take the pawn on f7. And rook to d8 for Linda. And let's see the notes of Linda at this point. Linda says, not defending the pawn on f7 was an error, and would rather have played king to g7. And computer agrees that rook to d8 was inaccuracy, not an error, and rather have the king go to g7. Let's continue the game. Queen to b3 for Linda. And queen to f5, and queen to b3 for Ralf, and Linda refuses to exchange the queens and places the queen on f5. Let's see the comment. But let's see before Linda had a comment for Ralf. The comment was that instead of placing the queen on b3, Ralf had better use his rook to take on b4 and have good he would lose an exchange for a pawn, but have fortress chances. And let's go back to see what exactly is this meant. Yes, Linda would rather have the rook go to take on b4 and exchange, and by doing so, yes, lose the exchange for a pawn, but have good chances to get a draw. But let's continue where we're now. For f5, Linda says that this was, it places a question mark. Would rather have the queen take on b3. My opponent was running out of time, Linda says. I also did not have a lot. I did not realize that I had the winning position if I exchanged queens. I was afraid of making an endgame mistake, especially against a better player. I thought exchanging queens would make it easier on him regarding time. Yes, of course, if you take the queen, then your opponent will take immediately your queen and not spend too much time. And later on, Linda would give possible variations until move number 49. And let's continue now. Pawn to f3 for Ralf, and pawn to h5 for Linda. Wants to attack along the king side, along the h file. And at this point, we completed the first 35 moves, and Linda has an advantage of 0.99. We continue. Queen to b2 for Ralf. That's hoping that if he can move his pawn to e6, get a discovered check, perhaps take the f7 pawn, and at least temporarily create an issue for Linda. Pawn to h4 for Linda, that attacks the bishop on g3, and the bishop goes on e1. Queen to f4 with a check for Linda. King to h1. And you see that Linda has an advantage of 1.4. Rook to d4 for Linda. What she wants to do is avoid the pawn on e5, going to e6 with a discovered check. Then it can easily go to f7 and be one square for promotion. Of course, it's not going to be promoted, but Linda will have to waste a couple of moves to stop it. Once again, we have a comment from Linda. She believes king to g8. I should have defended that f7 pawn. Then maybe I would have won. And then she places all her moves until all the possible moves until 49 for 10 more moves. How the game could have gone. Let's continue. Queen to b3 for Ralf, and queen takes a pawn on e5 for Linda. Mistakes in the computer, and let's see what Linda has to say. I was so obsessed with getting the pawn, I didn't see queen takes on f7, but also I only had a minute on the clock for completing 40 moves. She would rather have placed the queen on f5 or the king on g8 and everything is defended. Let's see what the computer says. Computer says that queen to f5 would be the best. And from 1.05, Linda's advantage falls down to 0.22. Let's continue. Queen takes on f7 for Ralf and queen to g7 for Linda. We completed the first 40 moves, and now, believe it or not, Ralf has an advantage of 0.36. Let's see what Linda has to say. Bishop d6. I missed this because I was in a time panic. If I had had more time to think, I could have found this, but at this point, it hardly makes any difference. Continue the game. Queen to h5 with a check for Ralf. King to g8 for Linda. Queen to e8 for Ralf. Queen to f8 for Linda. And now it is repetition. And at this point, the players agreed on a draw, but it was a threefold repetition. Linda, congratulations. She played with a player that was 174 points higher than her. She had the black pieces and got a draw, and perhaps she could have won it. She had an advantage for a large part of the game. But let's now do the review. What does the computer have to say about this game? And when I say computer, let's make it clear it is Stockfish 16 that chess.com is using for this analysis. You see how the game went, more or less even at some points. Linda had small advantages that I think 1.34 is or 1 point something like that was the biggest. Accuracy 92.4 for Ralph and 92.7 for Linda. I played a little bit better. And they played as if their rating was 24-15. No brilliant moves. Linda had one great. Book 5 for Ralph, 4 for Linda. Best 20 for Ralph, 18 for Linda. Excellent 8 for Linda, 4 for Ralph. Good 9 for Ralph, 8 for Linda. Inaccuracy 7 for Ralph, 5 for Linda. 1 mistake for Linda, and no misses or blunders. This concludes the presentation of this game. Once again, I would recommend to the viewers, if you can find the book, The Safety Variation of Linda Bellamy, please do so. It's a very interesting book. And let's see how things are going in the other tournaments that I've been following. The one that I'm hosting myself, which is the grecochess, same story again. We are 2 games away from the ending, and it's a game between Maxim Govorukha from the Ukraine and Barak 7 from Israel. They have defeated 4 wins in 4 games. They have won against their other opponents, and everything depends on the 2 games between them that are still going on. And in the other game, in the underline Moonlight and 9 Moons tournament, that is hosted by one of our subscribers. We already know who has advanced. There are a few games remaining in the first round to be over, and then the semi-final to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, that was this video about Linda Bellamy's game. I hope you enjoyed it. Linda, thank you very much for sharing this game with us, and wishing you all the best, both as an author with your book and also in the chess world. Hopefully you can increase your ratings in the next year and have more games to share with us. Thanks to all the viewers, the subscribers. Thanks to the likes, the comments. This is Greco Chess YouTube channel. I'm your host, Harry Series, and for now, goodbye.